As president of the Association of Black Cardiologists, I welcome you to our webinar, I Can't Breathe, Reflections on Racism, Anti-Blackness, and a Path Forward Globally and in Cardiovascular Medicine. I bring greetings from our board chair, Dr. Elizabeth Afili, and our CEO, Mr. Sandra McCullough. Thank you for joining us during these unprecedented times within the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and a call to action about the persistent history of racism in our country and worldwide. On behalf of the Association of Black Cardiologists, I want to thank the leadership of the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology for standing in solidarity with us against racism and violence. Our recent events provide the opportunity to harness our collective humanity to bring forth historical, powerful change. Indeed, the mission of the ABC has always aligned with an arc towards justice. Next slide. We will forever continue to honor the countless, fearless, and nameless Blacks who have experienced unimaginable violence, imprisonment, and have lost their lives due to discrimination. Certainly, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected Blacks, amplifying and unroofing long-standing social, economic, and health inequities rooted in a history of discrimination, particularly structural racism. In medicine and highly competitive subspecialties such as ours, cardiovascular medicine, these same structural issues are operative. Let us consider some statistics. Blacks comprise 13% of the population, 8% of medical students, 4% of the physician workforce, 2% of cardiologists, and 30% of cardiology training programs have no underrepresented minorities. Additionally, 10 chairs of internal medicine are Black, 9 men and 1 woman. There are 3 cardiology chiefs in top 40 programs, 2 of whom are on our Zoom webinar today. Among full professors, 18% are Black and Hispanic men, and 9% are Black women, compared to 36% white men and 24% white women. Data about deans are generally woeful. So what are 5 things that we can do in medicine to address healthcare disparities? We need to address the medicine pipeline. This also includes recognizing and addressing gatekeeping in the academy, regardless of race or ethnicity. We need to address diversity in clinical trials, and this includes patient diversity, and also promoting main PIs or principal investigators who are Black or Hispanic, Latinx. We need to address access to equitable and quality healthcare. Next slide. We need to advocate for policy and institutional initiatives that eliminate educational and economic disparities, including in local, urban, and suburban school districts. We need to demand standardized testing reform, or some may argue abolition. Stop differential educational and training required evaluations by race ethnicity. And we also need to address inequalities in promotion, advancement, and endowed chairs in our institutions. At ABC, we are continuously striving to be solution-focused, and in this vein, we have some very exciting news. Today, we are launching the Association of Black Cardiologists COVID-19 Innovation Awards. We will award 6 awards of up to $50,000 each. These awards will support applicants who propose and implement novel, targeted, and sustainable approaches at the community level aimed at preventing COVID-19 infection and spread, particularly in Black and Hispanic communities. Applications are due July 28, 2020 by 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We strongly encourage fellows in training and early career cardiologists to consider application submissions. Please visit the ABC website at the conclusion of this webinar for details. We are grateful to Amgen for helping to support these Association of Black Cardiologists COVID-19 Innovation Awards. Now, we are honored to present to you a powerful tapestry of 21, yes, 21, testimonies about racism and reflections about moving forward from African-American cardiovascular medicine professionals and African-American police chiefs. The ABC thanks our speakers for your commitment and for standing up to be part of this program, despite your busy, extremely busy lives at short notice. Wow. I will briefly introduce each speaker individually. The views of our speakers are theirs only and do not necessarily represent the views of the Association of Black Cardiologists. But before we get started, I want us to take a brief moment of silence to remember a true champion of the ABC and the wife of our next speaker and founder of the ABC, Miss Janita Evangelista Johnson, who left this world at 1:30 a.m. this past Saturday, June 13, 2020. Gigi was a force to be reckoned with. She was brilliant, successful entrepreneur, and leader who was part of the ABC family. She generously and selflessly donated her time and financial resources to ABC in order to improve the lives of others. Rest in peace, Gigi. Your ABC family will always remember your smile, grace, and kindness eternally. A moment of silence, please. I am certain that it is with a sorrowful and heavy heart that Dr. Richard Allen Williams, next slide, ABC founder, clinical professor of medicine, at University of California, Los Angeles, and past president of the National Medical Association, will speak to us now.
Thank you very much, Michelle, Dr. Albert. I just want to amplify the tribute that you are giving to Gigi, my beloved wife and recent decedent. I don't know why God gave us such an impossible act to follow, but Gigi gave us a perpetual master class in elegance, charm, style, and grace, and represented the epitome of philanthropy and kindness, especially as expressed to the ABC. She was my rock and the best role model for good that I've ever seen. So I just wanted to amplify that tribute with that brief statement about her. And of course, she will be missed mostly by me. I want to continue with some very brief remarks, and these will really be brief, in regards to our subject matter for discussion today. When I founded ABC 45 years ago, I had no idea that we would be coming to this kind of pass, to first of all, witness the fantastic eruptions that have occurred in society and the disturbances in social justice and lack of delivery of social justice that we have seen. So not to make a speech about that, I want to just very briefly go back in history and come forward in regards to the subject matter. The 1790 census, which was our first census, indicated that there were three groups of people in the United States: those who were identified as free white, others who were called all other free persons, and the third group was slaves. Now, the slaves were subsequently surveyed by a statistician named Hoffman from the Prudential Insurance Company. And very briefly, in surveying the US slave population, he found that their health care was so deficient that he predicted that Blacks would be extinct by the year 2000. And of course, Blacks are still there, but you get the message that the origin of healthcare disparities was right there. And I bring that up because of the fact that now we are faced with situations which amplify the concerns that we have about Black survival, and in particular, join in on this national conversation on violence and the police use of force as indicated by the George Floyd situation. I want to finish by reading a brief statement, which is a letter to the editor of the New York Times, which I wrote, which focuses on this particular aspect and comes completely into the realm of I can't breathe. I wrote this letter on May 30th, and I said, I'm writing to you about the George Floyd tragedy and specifically about how he died. I'm a Black cardiologist and professor of medicine at UCLA, and I have a unique perspective on the anatomical aspects of this egregious killing of a Black man. We know that Mr. Floyd ostensibly passed away on May 25th, 2020, from having a police officer place his knee in Mr. Floyd's neck. The medical examiner stated that there was no evidence of strangulation on autopsy, and underlying conditions and potential intoxicants were speculated to be the cause of death. And I go on to say that I think most cardiologists would agree that this might have stimulated a vascular structure in the neck called the carotid sinus, which can cause the heart rate to slow and to eventually flatline. So Mr. Floyd was constrained by physical arrest with handcuffs, followed by cardiac arrest from a knee in the neck. Now, there are numerous precedents for this lethal scenario. One of the most recent was the case of Eric Garner, a young Black man who died after being placed in a chokehold in New York City in July 2014. George Floyd used the same words as Eric Garner, which is the title of our program, while being pinned to the ground. I can't breathe. I was personally involved with the controversial chokehold in the 1980s in Los Angeles, when 16 young men, 12 of whom were Black, died over the course of several months after being subjected to this suppressive, barbaric police tactic. In an attempt to attain medical support for his outrageous declaration that the Black men had died because of an anatomical anomaly in their necks, LA Police Chief Daryl Gates, who authorized his police to use the chokehold, consulted me because I had written a book, The Textbook of Black-Related Diseases, which focused on differences in the medical experience between Blacks and whites, and the need to recognize that Blacks have special health care needs. He assumed that I would corroborate his contention that Blacks were somehow anatomically different from whites, and that a deficiency in their neck arteries was the real cause of their death, a theory which I vehemently refuted in a press conference. The chokehold and its variations are still being used. Black men are dying because of it, and then being blamed for having pre-existing conditions, which would make them vulnerable to its deadly effect. In other words, they are suffering the ultimate insult, which is blaming the victim. We must come to a realization that police brutality and the excessive use of force is part of the American fabric, which needs to be cut out. In cases like the George Floyd tragedy, medical authorities have an ethical responsibility to provide their expertise in analyzing these situations so that justice can properly be served. I believe that we doctors took an oath to do exactly that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Richard Allen Williams, for your testimony. Our next speaker will be Dr. Faluso Fakaridi, CEO of Cardiovascular Solutions in Central Mississippi and co-chair of the ABC Peripheral Artery Disease Initiative.
Good morning. Thank you to the ABC leadership for their invitation to be on this esteemed panel, and my sincerest condolences to Dr. Williams. The fundamental recognition of being a human being, the bedrock of human rights, was ignored when we all watched Mr. George Floyd state for a long 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I can't breathe. It also ignored, and is also ignored, whenever you see the snapshot of an amputee that was probably never given a fighter's chance to live a productive and healthy life. Their hourglass of life turned upside down, with 80% dead within 5 years of their index major amputation, 3 to 5 times likely to occur if you're Black, independent of your socioeconomic status. Anti-Blackness lies at so much of the core of what's problematic in our society today. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Dr. Martin Luther King said. And as a Black interventional cardiologist and the only Black limb salvage specialist in the Mississippi Delta, I currently make up less than 1% of the population that Dr. Albert referred to in her introductory remarks. I performed a limb-saving procedure on a 49-year-old Black mechanic who had diabetes and was on dialysis early in 2015 when I moved here to Mississippi. The surgeon had also been consulted on the case. The patient had a non-healing wound on the same foot that required a toe amputation 8 months prior to my arrival. Our procedure was successful, and I texted the picture of the final angiogram results to the entire team caring for the patient before I left town for the weekend. Shockingly, by Monday, I found out that that leg had been amputated. I have agonized over this case and the patient and his family, who suffered in isolation until his death last year. It was that poignant moment that I truly grasped the need for the defense of humanity and justice for our vulnerable population, and it became a personal mission with heightened urgency to be a voice for those who lack the megaphone. In the recently published ProPublica article titled "The Black Amputation Epidemic," we highlight the amputation lottery map, the map of the Black census-scope of America. The same map has the highest rates of patients with risk factors for peripheral arterial disease and other polyvascular diseases. The Mississippi Delta has one of the highest amputation rates, the lowest number of revascularization procedures to salvage limbs, the lowest number of physicians per capita, and the highest burden of chronic health diseases in our country. Mississippi is currently the poorest state in the U.S. today, but once was the fourth largest economy in the world in 1860, with cotton being king. Mississippi had more slaves than any other state. In fact, an enduring legacy till this date of having a Black population of almost 40%, majority of whom reside in the Mississippi Delta. So PAD remains the most prevalent, debilitating, deadly, and costly pandemic that most have either neglected or never heard of, affecting 21 million Americans and disproportionately killing off Black and brown people. If left unchecked, leads to 200,000 amputations, 65% of which are due to diabetes. African Americans are 65% more likely than whites to be diagnosed with diabetes. Every 30 seconds, a limb is amputated due to PAD or diabetes. Diabetic patients present more with late stage that wound heal without intervention or an angiogram. An angiogram decreases the odds of a major amputation by 90%, but 90% of African Americans in this state have never been offered this option, with the national average being 50%. In terms of the landscape of the peripheral vascular space, there are limited content of addressing health disparities at major pharmaceutical and device-sponsored societal meetings. There are limited endorsements of preventative statements that could stop perpetuating disparities in screening, treatment, and outcomes. Limited access to quality care and insurance. There are no incentives for cardiovascular specialists to independently come to these underserved areas and thrive, with refusal to expand Medicaid, adding fuel to the fire. Despite the fact that 520,000 Mississippians are uninsured and 750,000 Medicaid recipients are burdened with all the chronic diseases or risk factors that end up in amputations, Medicaid does not cover prosthesis in the state of Mississippi. It puts a chokehold on the visits to specialists, with endocrinologists mainly not accepting Medicaid, and puts a stifling quota on the number of medications covered. These are all patterns and practices that devalue and dehumanize the Black and brown individuals across the entire spectrum of healthcare, with the proverbial knee lodged in the neck of minority people. The knee is constantly and systematically kept on our necks. We can't breathe. So the disturbing practices of offering an amputation-first treatment strategy must end. The cost to our healthcare system is close to $380 billion a year. It's also a burden to our workforce due to the loss of productivity. Majority of the burden paid for by taxpayer dollars, all on this call today. Multiple studies have shown that early screening, implementing effective medical therapies, and timely performance of revascularization in critical limb ischemia leads to limbs and lives saved. We've shown this by decreasing amputation rates by 88% over a 4-year span. This fight has led to policy action, realizing it would take both education and legislation to regulate behavior. Morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. You may not love me, but you will not chop off my leg. Addressing key modifiable risk factors, improving access to quality cardiovascular care, addressing social determinants of health are all long-term strategies that are key salient first steps. But legislation is needed to control the external effects of bad internal attitudes, restrain the heartless. So my hat's off to Congressman Donald Payne Jr. and Congressman Gus Billouakis, who recently established the first ever bipartisan PhD caucus, working with the ABC at the helm of these efforts to support legislative activities to improve PhD research, education, and treatment. The bill will demand Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial coverage of PhD screening for at-risk patients, vascular screening of at-risk patients based on ACC/AHA guidelines, disallowance of non-traumatic amputations without documented anatomical testing, and development and implementation of quality measures that incentivize multidisciplinary approaches to treat this disease. In conclusion, we will continue agitating the levers of power for things to get better. We have a mandate, a righteous indignation. Just as the systems in our body work in harmony, so too should our healthcare system, our government, our schools, financial, religious institutions, and community stakeholders. Focus on the future of our people with thoughts of our course of actions to make their dreams come true by any means necessary. Be the change. Equality matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Falusa Fakaridi. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sabra Lucy, who's an advanced heart failure and transplant cardiology fellow at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Lucy.
Thank you for the opportunity to join such a wonderful and accomplished group of people. I really continue to be inspired by your collective excellence, and to Dr. Williams, my sincere condolences. In light of the recent killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, I've been in a period of reflection on my own personal experiences and those of my friends and my loved ones. And in that reflection, I have felt anxious, helpless at times, and tired. I remember educational experiences, one in particular, walking home from studying at the library with a friend when we were preparing for a pre-med chemistry exam, when a car drove up on us and threw some type of foul-smelling liquid out of the car, shouted some epithets at us and sped away. And we were there shocked and horrified. And really that was just one event in a series of multiple events. I remember the N-word being put across the apartment door of one of my schoolmates, and several of my classmates being stopped on their way to class for fitting a description. I even remember falling asleep on top of my books one evening, studying for an exam and being escorted out of the building by an officer who said that this wasn't a place for homeless people and refused to look at my student ID. And so these are experiences that I have encountered, I've prepared my heart for, and I've prepared my heart from them, really from the oral history of my own family members who had gone through so many things in their own lives. And it's a unfortunate legacy that will be passed on to my children that they will inherit. However, there are other experiences of subclinical, subconscious, but still pervasive microaggressions that can feel equally traumatizing. I remember one of my medical school interviews. It was a school that I was extremely excited about. I was there for the most important meeting of the day, I should say, gearing up for that. Walked in, exchanged niceties. The interviewer grazed through my folder, closed it, and looked directly at me and said, "So what makes you different from other Blacks? How come you have been able to achieve? Are both of your parents Black?" And I was so just shocked and felt trapped and speechless in that moment, where I was effectively facing a gatekeeper to my education. Just a year ago, I was leaving one of the hospital units, and I was exhausted because we had just resuscitated a patient and got them back, and it looked like it was going to be okay. And I really felt like I had made a difference that day. And I had my white coat on, was headed down in the elevator by myself. The elevator parted. at a floor on my way down, and a man and woman were standing there. The woman started to walk onto the elevator. The man grabbed her arm, stopped her, and said, "I'm not getting on the elevator with that." And I looked around and I realized I was the only person or thing on the elevator. And so I thought, maybe there's a problem with my white coat. So there's more things that I could share. I'm going to refrain in the interest of time, but I want to close really with just a few points. The first is that diversity and inclusion is incredibly important. However, seats at the table is really only just the first step. It's not the solution in and of itself. If we are going to really tackle these big picture problems of stamping out cardiovascular disease and disparities, ending a pandemic, achieving health for our population, as stakeholders, as leaders, as advocates, we have to ask ourselves, are we promoting a culture of hypoxia, or are we planting seeds of empowerment, equity, and investment? And what do we take personal responsibility for? The last thing that I would like to mention, given that education has been a passion of mine, is the importance of mentorship. It's been one of the most valuable investments that's been made in me, and one of the most valuable investments that I think I can make. My mentors have certainly made a tremendous impact on me. So I really implore all of us to think about how we can expand our reach by mentoring a diverse group of people and changing the path for the future. Again, I applaud the ABC for being a living legacy of leaders. I can't even tell you how much it's meant in my training to have a resource of people who are committed to diverse cardiovascular care, ending disparities, supporting underrepresented trainees, and really bringing that spirit and that heart to our communities in education and being on the front lines and grassroots advocacy. And so I really thank you all, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this.
Thank you, Dr. Lucy, for that moving testimony. Our next speaker will be Dr. Ivor Benjamin, who is a professor of medicine in physiology, pharmacology, and multiple other things at the Fort Worth and Medical College of Wisconsin. He's the director of the Cardiovascular Center at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He's the co-director of the NIH T32 program, and he's the immediate past president of the American Heart Association.
Dr. Albert, thank you very much. I would also like to express my condolences to Dr. Williams. I would say that this is an extraordinary panel, and I'm privileged to be joining such an august group. And I particularly want to echo what Dr. Albert mentioned in terms of the statement of solidarity from the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, and the ABC. Why this time? Well, silence is not an option. As we have all been familiar with the impact of health disparities with COVID-19, the impact of pre-existing conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, obesity, on, if you will, the morbidity and mortality of COVID-19. I've been especially moved to better get an insight, to gain a better insight as to the impact of racism and violence, which of course culminates in psychological stress and its impact on cardiovascular disease. I've been specifically thinking about the social determinants of health, which according to the World Health Organization, discusses where people live, where people work, where people play. And what I'm going to do today is focus on where people go to school. As you very well know, in the middle of March, when we were all told to shelter from schools, Black and brown kids were immediately reduced to their homes, which are oftentimes more dense, which are oftentimes will remove them from their schools that can potentially be a safe haven. But more importantly, it meant that they had to be then engaged in distance learning or even virtual education. I'll get back to that in a moment. There's a substantial literature on early adverse childhood experiences. The thesis I would like to leave with you today is that COVID-19 should not be an early adverse childhood experience, especially for Black and brown kids. Why do I make that hypothesis? Now, let me say that if you were just to restart school in the fall and you were just to look at education, it's estimated that there'll be a 70% drop in reading and a 50% decline in math. The most critical times to learn math is in your 5th, 6th, and 7th grades. Most people on this webinar who are listening to us probably did well in STEM education. If there are only 2% of African Americans who are cardiologists, there is no question in my mind that we have to focus on our kids in schools. As Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx recede from the national headlines, who then become the voices for communities of color, for Black and brown kids? Who will be able to bring the critical health information? So working in partnership with school administrators, as well as parents, as well as, of course, the health department, we have to really be able to think about a strategy in order for us to really be able to get our kids back into the schools. This is no easy task. There's no question that we'll have to do all the things around social distancing, physical distancing, which is the term I prefer, as well as, of course, being able to have important information around PPEs. Speaking with the superintendent of schools here in Milwaukee, he has a budget that will devote close to $20 million just to really be able. We have to anticipate that there will be some form of hybrid education, but there is no question in my mind that giving voice for the voiceless is a theme that's consistent with ABC's I Can't Breathe. And let me now say that, of course, George Floyd called for his mother. My grandmother said, Ivor, 1 ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We have to commit ourselves so that COVID-19 does not become a pre-existing condition for cardiovascular health disparities. Disparities for which there are not enough cardiologists to take care of them. But if we do not basically redouble our efforts for our young children, for them to get an education, then we will not be able to address the pipeline issues, let alone to close the gap on disparities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ivor Benjamin. Well said words. The next speaker will be Dr. Karol Watson, who's a professor of medicine at UCLA Division of Cardiology at the David Geffen School of Medicine. She's the director of UCLA Women's Cardiovascular Health Center and the UCLA Barbara Streisand Women's Heart Health Program. She's also the UCLA director of the Cardiovascular Medicine Fellowship. Welcome, Dr. Watson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albert. Thank you so much to the organizers. I can't tell you how much this means to all of us. And to Dr. Williams, Richard, I love you. I love Gigi, and she's always with us. And thank you for all you've meant to so many. Racism, both subtle and not so subtle, is rampant. It's all around us, and it's even rampant in medicine. I personally remember that moment in medical school when the patient openly announced, I don't want that Black girl taking care of me. To the time a senior researcher absolutely eviscerated my presentation. It was pretty good. While really effusively praising others. To the committees that qualified Black and brown physicians aren't appointed to the panels where there's not a single diverse face on the stage, we all lose. Everyone loses. Minorities endure countless microaggressions daily. Sometimes, as people of color, we're expected to hide our true selves. We can't be too loud, too smart, too radical, too anything. We're asked to swallow our words, suppress our feelings. Sometimes it feels metaphorically as if we can't breathe. But the greatest tragedy really is the microaggressions that are directed daily to our patients. How many Black and brown patients have been described as difficult, demanding, drug-seeking, abusive, non-compliant, just things that aren't right? Because what they really are is sick, and we have to treat them like that. How many patients who are Black and brown suffer earlier disease, more deadly disease, more severe disease, all of which might be avoided? I think there are a number of things we have to do to move forward. First of all, I really strongly believe we have to intervene much earlier. Just like Dr. Benjamin mentioned, we can't allow our students to fall behind. Talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. So developing a truly diverse medical workforce is a foundation, and that means reaching into our elementary schools, our middle schools, our high schools to develop and support this talent. We cannot keep leaving all of this beautiful, wonderful, diverse talent on the table. We have to give opportunities to everyone, and we will see how we will all flourish. I've seen many statements from medical organizations, including some very august ones, in support of Black Lives Matter. But in some of those, if you look at the power structures of those organizations, there's often a glaring lack of diversity. That really just makes those statements ring hollow. You can't talk the talk if you don't walk the walk. You can't put a pretty Band-Aid on a gaping, jagged hole and expect people not to notice. Unless we have a truly diverse workforce from top to bottom, we can never hope to achieve justice. And that starts by reaching into our youngest people. And finally, I'd like to end with exactly what Dr. Lucy just said. Mentorship is key. Mentorship is key. If I can't bring 10 people up with me, what have I done? We have to be there for all of us to help mentor the next generation. And as an organization, the Association of Black Cardiologists has done that in spades, and I'm forever grateful for that. But that is where I think we need to go. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. A big virtual hug in support of what you just said, indeed. Our next speaker is Dr. Eldrin Lewis, who is a professor of medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine, and he's also the newly anointed chief of cardiovascular medicine at Stanford University. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albert. I appreciate you for organizing this important webinar and for inviting me. I also would like to extend my condolences for your loss of your beloved wife, Dr. Williams. These past few weeks have led me to reflect on my normal. I have roots in the Mississippi Delta in the post-civil rights era. As a child, I would have friends who would tell me that I couldn't visit their homes because their dad didn't like Blacks. And as president of the student body, I was able to orchestrate the first prom post-segregation in 1987, but it was 1987. I moved to Pennsylvania thinking that I left racism behind in a naive way, until people said, open your eyes so that I can see you. And these are not things that are unique to me. And these don't reflect all of America. It reflects people who continue to espouse racism. As I became a doctor, I had constant questions during my training about my credentials. I would often be confused for cleaning staff, for transport, all of whom are very important parts of a hospital ecosystem. But it wasn't why I was there. I was there to help the patient. And of course, like many of you, I was pulled over, after driving home from work for no cause. And I had to think about, how can I stay alive? These normals are constant drips that create anxiety, stress, and can take one off of their focus, of their dreams, their goals, their job. These normals are like the deaths of Mr. George Floyd, and these normals can be seeds of anger. I think as the country continues to hurt, it's important that we realize that these normals need to be changed, and we need to have new normals. And I have 5 reflections as we move forward. I think the first thing that we can do is fight for policy changes. We should fight for health equity and fight for higher education. We can do this at our institutions. We can do this through the research that sheds light into some of the inequities. And we can do this through population efforts. I think the second thing that we can do is cultivate the pipeline across disciplines. Of course, I would be focused on STEM and trying to encourage people to go into research and to be physicians. But we need leaders across the spectrum of the workforce. And we need to start at a young age. We can't wait until high school. We can't wait until college. We have to really start when they're starting to walk and starting to learn to talk. The third thing is until these changes that we so desperately need, until these changes happen in our nation, we need to teach our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, how to navigate the society and stay alive till we'll reach the promised land, as Martin Luther King stated over 50 years ago. The fourth issue is we should be successful and then use our success to mentor and to pull others up and influence change, starting locally and expanding globally. And then finally, health. We need to focus on reducing hypertension, diabetes, increasing exercise, reducing heart disease, because healthy aging allows us all to grow old and make differences in the lives of our individual families, but also in all of the people that we touch. Thank you very much for all of your efforts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for those poignant statements. Our next speaker will be Chief William Scott, who's the Chief of Police for the San Francisco Police Department. Chief Scott was sworn in on January 23rd, 2017 by Mayor Ed Lee in San Francisco as the Chief of Police. He joined the SFPD after serving 27 years in the Los Angeles Police Department. Chief Scott grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and has a keen focus on community policing and is actively involved in implementing major reforms in the SFPD. Welcome, Chief Scott, for coming out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I also want to offer my condolences, to Dr. Williams for the loss of his wife. You know, the tragic death of Mr. George Floyd after being involved in an incident with police officers is extremely disturbing to all of us. What I and everyone else saw in the video images, of this incident is flat wrong and not consistent with the respect for the sanctity of human life that all men and women who are sworn peace officers have a duty to uphold. Furthermore, the issues intersect squarely with policing disparities that have occurred for generations and continue to occur in regard to the use of force on people of color, specifically Black and brown men. Since Mr. Floyd's tragic death, I've been asked the following questions by many people, both from local residents here in San Francisco and including national news reporters. And the question is this: how does it feel to be an African-American police chief right now in the midst of a national policing crisis, squarely centered on injustices and disparities perpetrated by police against African-Americans? My answer is always the same. As a Black man, I understand what it feels like to be a Black man in this country. Having have grown up in a segregated and racially divided Deep South in the early 70s, just after the epic civil rights movement in the 1960s, a movement in which many of my family members protested in the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, and had dogs let loose on them, fire hoses unleashed on them, and many of them lost their freedom for standing up and demanding basic human rights. I have lived and felt the impact of institutionalized racism, segregated and inferior schools that I attended. Explicit bigotry and racism were the norm and not the exception during my childhood. In the late 1980s, I moved to California and began my career in the city of Los Angeles as a police officer. 2.5 years into my career, another pivotal incident occurred, and that was the videotape beating of Mr. Rodney King that resulted in the acquittal of 4 officers who were accused of beating him. I was at work in the city of Los Angeles on the evening of April 29, 1992, when Los Angeles erupted in the worst civil unrest of that generation. When it was all said and done, over 60 people lost their lives. After living through this incident, I often found myself asking the question, have things really changed in America for the better for African Americans? Since the Rodney King incident, we've seen Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, and now George Floyd needlessly lose their lives at the hands of police officers. There have been others, and I want to be respectful for the other people who have needlessly lost their lives at the hands of police officers, but here are a couple common themes involving the names of the men that I just named. All were captured on video for the world to see, for the world to examine, and for the world to decide on whether these tragic deaths were justified or if they were just. The same can be said in the tragic death of Mr. George Floyd. And again, I find myself asking, and we all have to ask ourselves, have things really changed for the better for African Americans in our country? The other question that I asked, and I asked you all to ask of yourselves, if any of these incidents had not been captured on video, what would have happened? Would it have been business as usual? Or did the transparency caused by these videos cause the demands for social justice and change? We can only speculate to the answer to that question, but here's one thing I hope we can all take away from this question. There are over 18,000 policing agencies in this nation. Some have now required the use of body-worn cameras and/or dash cameras, but many haven't. For those agencies that have not, we have to ask the question, why not? Because one thing is certain, a lack of transparency in policing is almost a guarantee of a continuance of the status quo. Transparency is a key step in the right direction for true accountability and real change. Now, to get back to the answer to that question, what it feels like to be Black and to be a police chief in this era of policing crisis in our country. I'm a Black man and I always will be. I'm proud to be a Black man. And I go back to what I said earlier about the struggles of my family and many people on this call whose families, and maybe people on this call who are actually in the struggle for our civil rights during the 60s. That's why I get a seat at the table. And to bring an African-American perspective in this time of change is what that struggle is all about. Sometimes I'm conflicted because I see the disparities firsthand. I've lived the disparities. I still pull off my uniform and I go to my local grocery store, my local shopping mall, and I've seen people follow me around the store. So I know what it feels like to be a Black man. But I also have a responsibility and an opportunity for real change. And that's because of the struggle of many of my forefathers, your forefathers, people that have paved the way for us to have a seat at the table. Now's the time for bold change and bold leadership. And I'm proud to be a part of it and hope that I can make a difference to change this narrative for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief William Scott, for those powerful comments and for your personal testimony. Our next speaker will be Dr. Jane Morgan, who's the Director of Innovation at Piedmont Healthcare in Atlanta, Georgia, and CEO of 40 Million Heartbeats, and a cardiologist.
Thank you, Dr. Albert, for having me today. My thoughts are with you, Dr. Williams, as well today. I'd like to start just with a little story, a recent story. I was at home maybe about 2 weeks ago, a little more than 2.5 weeks ago. My son called me, my oldest son, and said, "Hey, Mom, I'm going to be on air tomorrow morning. It'll be early. It'll start at 5, but I think I'm going to get airtime between 5 and 8 in the morning." And I laughed and said, "Okay, I'll get up, but I'm not sure I'll make the 5 o'clock, but I'll get up to see you. Got off the phone. The next morning, I probably arose around 6, turned on the television, turned on to CNN, where he was going to be reporting, and saw them placing my son in handcuffs. He had on a face mask. And I think it's the only thing that I can say is when you are immediately awakened and expecting to see something that is not what you see on the screen, it's hard for your brain to organize what your eyes are seeing. And I said out loud, is that Omar? Is that my son? He had on a face mask. Maybe that's not him, but I knew it was him, and I could feel my heart beating. I heard him ask, why am I being handcuffed? And I saw them walk him away. I immediately began calling every number I could find for the Minneapolis Police Department. As you could imagine, we're on the East Coast at 6 a.m. They're in Minneapolis. No one was answering any of the numbers that I listed. I was calling everywhere. I then began to call CNN, any number that I had for CNN. And in the background, CNN was reporting live. They've walked him away. Has he been arrested? What's happening? I can't believe this is going on. They had different people commenting. Everyone was scrambling, trying to figure it out. I was at home alone, trying to figure out how I was going to reach my son. I wanted to make it clear to the Minneapolis Police Department that he was loved, that someone was looking for him. I even called the CNN tip line and left a tip. I am the mother of Omar Jimenez. I need somebody to call me. That's your tip for the day. They man it 24 hours. I steadied myself, continued on that path. Meanwhile, my village was activated. People were calling me, including attorney friends, telling me that they were on standby for anything that I would need, including going out to Minnesota. Bakari Sellers came on the air at CNN. To that point, I was still relatively calm, swallowing, hadn't been able to reach anyone, had even called Omar a couple of times to see if he was allowed to answer his phone or if someone else would answer the phone. And Bakari Sellers said, I fear for Omar. I really am afraid for his safety. And when he gave voice to those private thoughts that I had, tears just began to stream down my face. I'm still sitting in my bedroom. The lights are out, the television is on, CNN is playing. And I remember saying, Jane, just focus. You gotta reach somebody. You're not there. Who can you call? And I began to call a couple of my friends who were very influential in politics to say what has happened, and I got them up. I don't know how much time passed, but the CEO of CNN called me, Jeff Zucker, and he said, I've gotten your messages. I don't know how he received them. I don't know how many phone calls I made. I called everyone. I think Don Lemon apparently also got the message that I was looking for him. So that's my village that was activated. I activated the village and people utilized their network. And Don Lemon understood that I was looking. Jeff Zucker called me, and Jeff Zucker said, I am talking with the governor of Minnesota and I will get back with you. Omar was released unharmed, but here's what he told me. He said that they put him in a police car and drove him, he doesn't know where, maybe a block or two away, he's not sure, and sat there for 30 minutes. And those are the types of things that we understand happen. And that's where terrible things happen to our men, our sons, our husbands, our brothers. He was not officially arrested. He wasn't booked in any place. Even if I had been able to reach the Minneapolis police, there was no formal record of him being anywhere. He was in that lost zone. When he was released, you know, I said to him, he called me, he was going back on air. He called me and I said, Omar, are you okay? I said, yeah, Mom, I'm fine. Did anything happen to you? No, I'll talk with you about it. And I said to him, he said, I know you were worried. And I said to him, the one thing that is on my heart and mind when I looked at that is, am I going to be another mother that the police call to tell me that my Black son has died in custody? And that was what I thought about. And I thought about that I have raised my son, Omar Jimenez, to be what America says they want to see in Black men. Well-educated, went to the #1 journalism school in the United States, Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism. Speaks languages, well-traveled, polite, deferential, humble. This is what America has said that they wanted. And before the entire world, it was demonstrated that it really doesn't matter, because the one thing that I cannot influence is his skin color, and I cannot influence his culture. And so that is where we are. And when we talk about the determinants of health, I think we need to begin to discuss what are the moral determinants of health, and how can we as physicians and scientists begin to reflect and impact the moral determinants of health, because those are all of the things that lead to voter suppression. If we have decreased life expectancy, if we have increased incarceration, those are forms of voter suppression. And the morality with which this country must grapple now is where we need to focus, and where healthcare really has an opportunity to take the lead. I have spent the last 2 years focused quite a bit on enrollment of minorities into clinical trials and the representation there and the development of drugs and devices that are relevant to our population. But all of those things not necessarily take a back seat, but they all come to the same point, that we have to understand and be able to address the anti-Blackness in our culture, the code switching that we need to do for certain environments and what that means, and that none of us are safe, certainly not the men in our culture and in our race are not safe. And so those are the comments that I'd like to make to leave with you. There is much work to be done. I think we're on the precipice of what's going to be a long journey, but we all must be ready to do what needs to be done, because ultimately we need to be able to be our authentic selves and address the anti-Blackness in our nation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morgan, for offering that live and real-time story that some of us also saw play out on TV. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Sherry Ann Brown, who is an assistant professor of medicine, the Froedtert and Medical College of Wisconsin. She's also the newly minted director of cardio-oncology at Medical College of Wisconsin. Welcome, Dr. Brown.
Dr. Albert, thank you for having me. Dr. Williams, my condolences. Many of you know that I write, and I share my experiences and thoughts in poetry or story. Let me read for you what I've written. Many have been wondering about what I, as a leader in various ways, am thinking about the racial pandemic juxtaposed with the coronavirus pandemic. In the coronavirus pandemic, I had been starting my emails with something like, I hope you have been able to stay well during these unprecedented times. One morning, I started to write an email to a group of people. At first I typed, "I hope you are well." Then I deleted that and started over, and then wrote, "I hope you are sorting through these multiply tumultuous times." I deleted that too, and skipped that intro altogether, and instead decided to share it with you. Let me tell you why. You should already be able to figure this out, but let me walk you through it. Here it is, plainly and simply. I hope you are not well. I hope you are not okay with seeing what is going on in the world around you. I hope you are not okay with the global ignorance we have as people. I hope you're not okay with the complacency with which we live our lives. I hope you are not well. I hope that your heart has been breaking inside due to centuries and decades of injustice. I hope your well-being has been ruffled, knowing that all are not well, that all is not well. We all agree that as a society, the goal is to be well. However, the goal we should desire is for all to be well. We cannot be true to ourselves until we honestly recognize that all are not well, until the futures of our Black men, women, boys, girls, and babies in this country and around the world are well. Until then, how can you be well? Together in community, how can we be well? We can be well when we start to admit that we are not. We can be well when we commit to open dialogue and truthful conversation about race. We can be well when we recognize our ineptitude as a society at understanding and addressing what ails us. We can be well when it finally legitimately rings true that all men, women, boys, girls, and babies in the United States indeed are understood, recognized, perceived, and treated as equal. As cardiologists, one of the most consistent chief complaints we address is shortness of breath. It is incongruent for us to not step in when those around us cannot breathe. It is important for us to diarrhea the false comfort with which we have clothed ourselves as a society, and instead wrap the edematous infrastructure of racism by speaking truth into the lives of every human being, especially our Black communities. As cardiologists, we cannot sit by silently as health inequities from COVID-19 and violence from those who have sworn to protect affect a large proportion of the population we have sworn to serve and care for. My friends, let us be doers and not only hearers. Let us make our mark as individuals and cardiology societies, as we are doing even with this webinar at this critical time in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sherry Ann Brown. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Dr. Bernard Ashby, who's an assistant professor at Columbia University Division of Cardiology at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami, Florida. Welcome, Dr. Ashby.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me, or afternoon on the East Coast. I send my condolences to Dr. Williams. ABC now has a powerful ally on the other side. You know, I'm the father of a 7-month-old, proud new father. And unfortunately, I'm worried that his story will end up being the same as mine, meaning that my story is typical of any Black male in the US. I've been pulled over more times than I can count. I've had guns pulled out on me for no reason. My brother, who is now deceased, was a victim of police brutality. And when he had the audacity to defend himself in the courts, he was punished and he went to jail for a year. He was expelled from school. He was basically made a second-class citizen after that. I have another brother in jail serving 10 years for a violation of probation. I am now the father figure in both of their kids' lives. And my purpose is to make sure that they don't become a statistic. Now that I'm back home in Miami, I've dedicated myself to serving my community and reconnected myself to my family, to my cousins, my siblings, but also the kids in the neighborhood. I see Black boys just like me getting locked up left and right by the police who are supposed to protect and serve them. The criminal justice system is racist. But the not so big secret is that the healthcare system is also racist. We just call that healthcare disparities. George Floyd was a healthcare disparity. We all know that he was murdered by the police. But it's very interesting that the healthcare system got let off the hook regarding his death. Let me explain. So after EMS arrived, they checked his pulse. He didn't have one. At that point, George Floyd was unconscious, unresponsive for about maybe 2 minutes, maybe not breathing for about a minute. So he was quite salvageable. The medic let that knee stay on his neck for another minute. Another minute. Then they picked his lifeless body up, did not protect his C-spine, didn't bother taking off the handcuffs, and then casually put him back in the back of that ambulance. They waited minutes to initiate basic life support. They didn't even do their job. The medic didn't care about George Floyd's Black life. We see the same story in COVID-19, where patients who are short of breath, saying they can't breathe, get turned away in ERs. We don't talk about that. We call those healthcare disparities. We attribute it to the prevalence of diabetes and hypertension and obesity in our communities, which are all true. But we dance around the fact that we're dealing with a racist healthcare system. Policing in America rightfully needs to be held accountable. But my first question is, when are we going to hold the healthcare systems accountable for the thousands of Black folks who die unnecessarily due to racism? My second and final question is, what are we going to do about it? Because asking for a change clearly is not working. We collectively have the power to change the system today if we simply woke up. And I'm happy to have everybody here today, but I think we need to start realizing our collective power and leveraging that to start demanding change and not asking for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashby, for sharing those very personal stories that are often reflective of way too many patients, families, and citizens, Black people in this country. Our next speaker will be none other than the Dr. Keith Ferdinand, an avid ABC member and supporter, professor of medicine at Tulane University School of Medicine and Heart and Vascular Institute in New Orleans, Louisiana. Dr. Ferdinand is the Gerald S. Berenson Chair in Preventive Cardiology at Tulane as well.
Thank you. My condolences to Dick. Thank you, Michelle, for this powerful panel. I'm going to be brief because I think there have been so many very interesting and important stories that I want to give everyone a chance to speak. I'm a child of the lower Ninth Ward, the neighborhood that was so heavily damaged by Katrina. Those of you who know me know that I was really at a loss after Katrina with the loss of my family home and my practice, as we drove in 2 cars like vagabonds looking for a place to live. But what you may not know is in 1965, when I was a child, my family was flooded in the same area, and we spent 2 days on the roof with 20 feet of putrid water. My grandfather died next door, bodies floating in the water. New Orleans is a great city, founded in 1698 by the French, built by African slaves and free men of color from the Caribbean. But for 300 years, that knee has been on our neck. I became a physician not because of some wild interest in medicine or science, but to service our community, as I know most of you have. And it's important that we recognize whether it be COVID-19 or police violence, these are all related to the legacy of slavery. Our patients don't adhere, often miss follow-up, don't follow instructions, not because they're ignorant, but because they know many times the caretakers, the physicians, the providers really don't care for them. It's important that we have these type of fora. Michelle, in her short tenure as president, has done wonders of addressing issues that the ABC has seen as so important since Dick Williams and others founded it many years ago. What are some of the solutions? Well, I'm not really sure there are any short-term solutions. These are structural inequalities. I don't see racism as someone calling me out of my name, passing in a pickup truck and hollering the N-word as they zip past. I see it in the poor structure of our educational system, the food deserts, the inequality in healthcare, the police violence, which has been going on for decades. The white-black death gap, if you go to the CDC and national statistics, has been persistent for years. The Heckler Report in 1985 detailed that. The Institute of Medicine and Unequal Treatment in 2002 detailed that. So I say to my colleagues, fight on, continue what you're doing. My younger colleagues, I hear the pain and the sorrow that you go through to struggle to get where you are, but remember, all of us have gone through similar struggles. And it's only by being persistent and dedicated to doing the best we can for the individual patient and the public health that we'll ever make a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferdinand, for your longstanding commitment to the health of Black people. Our next speaker is Dr. Melvin Eccles, who's an assistant professor of medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine. He's also the program director of the Cardiology Fellowship Program at Morehouse. Welcome, Dr. Eccles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albert. And again, my condolences to Dr. Williams as well. I think that this is such an incredible time for our people. I think that overall, in terms of medicine and cardiology, the fact that 2% of all cardiologists are African Americans, I think these are all things that are so persistent in terms of why are we having these talks and why are we having these discussions today? You know, I have had my share of experiences of asked how many scholarships I had or sports scholarships I had or questions about my credentials, as many of you have. But I think that it's important, as Dr. Ferdinand said, to continue to be persistent and to continue to fight and to continue to encourage the seeds of encouragement. I think there are three, from my standpoint, I think there are three factors or three goals that I feel that are very important in terms of moving forward and trying to build the next future or the next generation of Black cardiologists. And I would ask yourself, you know, as a program director and as from a training institution, ask yourself, what does the future African-American cardiologist look like? I think we should establish hope again. I think hope is incredibly important. Growing up in the South with not much in terms of background, having people work in factories and never have, you know, thoughts of going to college, I think that it's very important for me to establish hope in those very bright people who don't always have the opportunities to make it. I think education is key. We are a part of an initiative to increase the training of minority cardiologists, and we thank the ABC for their support of our fellowship as well. But I think that we need to continue to push and continue to find those people who are talented and will be leaders of our field in the future. What does that future African-American cardiologist look like? In terms of mentorship, I think this is incredibly important. And I've been very blessed to have mentorship from a number of people, actually a number of people on this panel. But I think it's very important for all of us who have had these strong mentors to continue to give back and to continue to mentor the next generation, and to continue to instill mentorship in them. And then finally, I feel that unity is of utmost importance for our people. I feel that we are in a time where there are so many initiatives and so many actions and so many movements to make a difference. But I urge everyone to be united in the word and be united in the message, to continue to help us figure out what does that African-American cardiologist look like in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eccles. Our next speaker will be Dr. Felix Sagadi, who is a cardiac electrophysiologist and president and CEO of the Georgia Arrhythmia Consultants and Research Institute. He's an associate professor of medicine at Mercer University, and he's a former ABC board.
Oh, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm in between procedures, but my main contribution to this discussion we have today relates one to the role I think that ABC is ever much more important to all of us. We can see the importance of organization and what organization that was recently started, like the Black Lives Matter, has been able to achieve on a global scale. I think we can see the potential for ABC as well. But one of the areas is that a lot of us have had, there are people in the society about the issue of police brutality and, killing of African-American population. But I think the issue also relates to just beyond even those in the professional life. There was an article published in January 2019, especially in the field of OBGYN. I was sharing with my wife, and I think it relates to every other specialty. OBGYN, because they had the highest number of minority physicians in that specialty. The people in the field are excessively disciplined, and the excessive reporting to organizations in institutions in their career path, whether it's during residency, like in our own town here. I've seen many young women, especially start residency, and they cannot complete it. And even if they complete it, their careers are short-circuited, that they are limited to the number of the type of procedures they can perform. And there's just not a good path for career development. And when you have that, it systematically eventually will kill one's confidence. And so I think ABC as an organization, I think, like I said, is more pertinent today. And I think what we have to develop, I think what we have done recently in trying to increase the number of minority doctors, I think there still has to be a level of engagement where we provide support to our members during fellowship, during training, and even after training and going into different career fields. One of the important things is that when I was finishing training, ABC guided us that when you go into this particular town, look at the number of the population of the town, if there are the Black doctors and stuff is there. But I think an area now that we need to start relating to people is to be able to guide individuals before they go settle in a town or settle in a location. What has been the history or career path for Black doctors in general in that community? I think we need to systematically start collecting this data. In addition, we have to engage more closely with the people that support us in the political arena, whether it's through the Congressional Black Caucus or some other avenue where we can investigate or at least have some data whereby Black doctors excessively reported to the NPDB, that's the National Practitioner Data Bank. My guess is yes, because I've served as chair of medicine for 4 years in our institution, and I always see the type of doctors that are reported, And it's almost like an uphill battle until there is some type of economic consequence to institutions to stop this practice. I think we're going to have people who will train, who will go through, all these years of training, and then they are threatened that if you don't comply or you leave town, people, lose the ability to perform, procedures they have spent many years to train for. And I think it's very important that, we address this issue. And the role that ABC has is to maybe, we need to get back to some of the things that have worked very well. For me, I really believe that I enjoy the support of a lot of mentors, and in my practice, all my partners are ABC members and we support each other. And I think that gives us unique strength. But I think when people are moving to certain towns, they are alone or they are the only one there, what kind of support can they have? And I think to point people in the right direction may be one of the ways that we go. Because without numbers, you are just like an easy picking. And that's basically my contribution to this matter, is that we need to at least find out we need to have the data. We know there is healthcare disparity in the country. And if we don't have Black doctors that have gone through training and their careers are cut short even before they could fully mature into practice, then it's like we're fighting a losing battle right up front. And that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sagadi, and thanks for your commitment to the Association of Black Cardiologists. Our next speaker will be Dr. Marwa Abdallah, who's an assistant professor of medicine at Columbia University Medical Center in New York and director of the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit Education. Hi, Dr. Abdallah.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Albert, and my condolences to you, Dr. Williams, on the loss of your wife. As everyone else has said, that the recent murder of George Floyd and countless others, along with the national discussion about racism, has allowed us all to reflect deeply on our experiences. And like other speakers here, I too have faced microaggressions and overt discrimination and racism in both personal and professional settings. It's been at every level, starting throughout my childhood, including my pre-medical, medical, and postgraduate training. I think the hardest has been while trying to take care of patients. And I recall a particularly painful experience in a hospital setting. I remember walking into the room, giving a friendly hello, and introducing myself as the physician to the patient and their family. But no one acknowledged my presence, and that's not surprising, to be honest. It's happened before. But as I usually do, I walked further in, thinking perhaps they had not heard me, repeating my introduction. But then an eruption ensued. The patient and his family's members proceeded to yell and state, how dare they? How dare they send in a Black physician? Is this some twisted experience? Is she even qualified to be in this hospital? And again, while sadly that's not the first time I'd heard this sort of language, what was more disturbing was a patient's family member who then grabbed my white coat, scrutinizing and rereading my name out loud by the lapel, and asking me if I was one of those Black Muslim Arabs, and then proceeded to yell that I was a Black terrorist and should be killed right here. I think the emotional and physical intimidation was the hardest to deal with on that day. My reflex was to run, to fight back, to pull his hands off my white coat. But digging deep, I took a step back. I calmly addressed the patient and family and walked out. And that was the hardest thing I could do, because I felt dehumanized. My head was reeling and I sought guidance from my own coworkers. And they dismissed me. And they said that I must have exaggerated my encounter. And some stayed silent. Some said, oh, they're just crazy. It probably wasn't as bad as you thought. I was hushed. I was told not to report my experience since the patient was always right. But I kept thinking, what about my own rights to be addressed with basic dignity? To feel safe and not discriminated in a professional space. And more importantly, to be supported by my own work colleagues. And I think silencing those of us who've experienced overt racism, discrimination, or microaggressions without empathy really further adds to the dehumanization that we have been experiencing. I think, as Dr. Benjamin said earlier, silence really is not an option, especially in the medical community. So I think as initial steps within the medical community, we need allies. We need allies who are willing to speak up, to have the empathy to validate our stories, to create a safe space to voice our collective experience. We need allies who are willing to use their own privilege to change the dialogue and impact positive change. But similarly, we also have to ask ourselves, how can we be better allies to those we mentor and those that come behind us? And lastly, I think we need the training of how to have these difficult conversations in real time, how to really lean into the discomfort to engage others on a painful topic. We can no longer afford to just profess our values. We need to start practicing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marwa Abdallah. Our next speaker will be Dr. Clyde Yancey. Dr. Yancey is the Magerstadt Professor of Medicine and Chief of Cardiology at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. He's the Vice Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Northwestern, and he's also a past president of the American Heart Association.
Dr. Albert, ABC, thank you for this opportunity for all of us to offer our reflections on racism in this very important webinar, I Can't Breathe. I too have metaphorical dyspnea. This is the time for voices to rise up. Silence is complicity with the status quo. There are only two choices, racist or anti-racist. Silence aligns with the former. I grew up in the Deep South, born in 1958. I have deep personal experiences with nearly every imaginable atrocity of hatred and racism. For me, racism is deeply personal. My wounds are deep, and the recent events we've experienced have made clear to me that my wounds are not healed. As I share with you my reflections, there will be only three. And in the spirit of thinking about a path forward, I will offer 3 action items. Number 1, clearly, I have known remarkable success, more than I deserve, and for which I'm very grateful. But please, don't celebrate my success. Demand more of my attention. In fact, demand more the attention of every successful leader, race irrelevant. My own uncomfortable truth is that I've not brought along enough talent of color. How much creativity has been left on the table? How many ideas crushed? How much hope destroyed? Any leader who does not pause and wonder, could more have been done, is disingenuous. So action item 1, I and other leaders on this panel can and should operationalize a redoubled effort to identify, nurture, mentor, and herald the careers of talent of color. Second reflection, I am a student, teacher, author, editor, and champion of science. We've described racial disparities in cardiovascular disease, especially heart failure, for over 20 years, but we and others have allowed race and racism to remain too ambiguously and, importantly, too silent in the medical literature. There is a science of aggression, stress, and discrimination, and it is manifest in the same cardiovascular disease disparities that we've all described, but without proper attribution. That needs to change. Action item 2, going forward, we need to acknowledge and make explicit the scientific premise of racism and incorporate racism in the biology of disease, especially cardiovascular disease. Here is my third and final reflection. Time continues. I have now lived longer than I will live. My focus today is on legacy creation, and now we have this crisis. My legacy will no longer be about heart failure or guidelines or leadership, or even about the American Heart Association, as much as I revere that organization. No, the only legacy that matters going forward is to enable the future of those to follow. Just as Elijah Saunders reached out to me as a nameless but Black second-year resident at Parkland in Dallas in 1983, we too need to extend our hand virtually, our support, and you know what? Our love to the next generation and the one that follows and the one that follows after that. I am where I am today because I stood on the shoulders of giants, one who is on this call, Richard Allen Williams, and I've already shared with him my condolences and they are sincere. But we need more giants. So action item 3, going forward, how many of us will take the role of a giant and provide a new plateau for the next generation? As a good teacher, I summarize what I've shared with you. Action item 1, identify and increase our efforts to bring forward the careers of talent of color. Action item 2, make an explicit acknowledgement and incorporation of the scientific premise of racism and our understanding of the biology of disease, especially cardiovascular disease. And action item 3 is to challenge. How many of us will take the role of a giant and create a new plateau for the next generation? Thank you, Dr. Albert.
Thank you, Dr. Yancey, for those wonderful and poignant comments. Our next speaker will be Dr. Erin Horn, who is a structural and interventional cardiologist and heart and vascular specialist of North Hills, Texas.
Thank you, Dr. Albert. Definitely want to first, again, offer my condolences to Dr. Williams. You know, this has been a very powerful discussion, and I will be brief in light of the time, and obviously a lot of other people have comments that need to be made. You know, one of the things that's been striking to me, and I think that the thing that struck me the most was hear Dr. Morgan talk about, you know, her son who had to deal with what he had to deal with while on TV. And, you know, during this period of time, we're getting a lot of phone calls from a lot of our friends of different ethnicities. And I got a phone call from a high school coach of mine. And some of this, you know, you suppress. But what you realize is that this starts at a really young age. And he called and said, you know, Aaron, I remember when you used to get pulled over driving to school because you were driving while Black. And I would go to the headmaster and he would say, well, we don't want to upset the apple cart, so let's just get along with it. And so this sort of normalization, a socialization, and my wife and I have 3- and 5-year-old boys. And it just starts at such a young age. And I can go through the, you know, being pulled over when walking home from the library when I was in medical school because I'm Black. And it's something that really sticks with you. And, you know, I do think obviously the most important thing is to try to be productive in terms of how we move forward. And so I say in terms of just challenging ourselves, in terms of also some of our colleagues, we talk about physician bias. You know, there's a lot of studies that when you ask physicians whether or not they have any biases, they say, whether or not biases exist in healthcare, they say yes. And they say, well, do you have any biases? Then the answer is no. So I do think that there's some amount of self-reflection that we need to bring to the forefront. And I do think that also it's important that while I'd love to see that the AHA and the ACC came out with a joint message with the ABC in terms of standing up against racism, but then what do we do from there? And I think that they need to be held accountable. We all have to be accountable about how we go about making true changes. And what people don't realize, nobody feels sorry for us as, you know, being Black cardiologists. You know, it's not just the microaggressions, but it's the active overt aggression in terms of, you know, being a Black cardiologist. If I instruct a colleague to give a particular medication, or if somebody's having a bad day, then we often, again, are labeled as being aggressive, and you know, and those things, they stick with you. And so I do see hope. And I guess my one comment to to sort of divert from what anybody else has said, yet today I'm really inspired by the young people right now, because it seems like they've had enough. And maybe there's something that we can learn from them, obviously doing things in a productive, thoughtful way. But I do think that it's time to do something different. So I've always sort of, during my involvement with the ABC, tried to encourage us to continue on the, the shoulders of people like Dr. Williams to think outside the box. And so hopefully this is an opportunity, an inflection point for us to do that. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Horn, for being here and for your comments. And we know that you had to cancel your entire clinic at short order to actually be with us here today. So we really appreciate that. Our next speaker is Dr. Kamar Brown. And Dr. Kamar Brown is a cardiovascular medicine fellow at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He's also a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Albert, for your introduction, and for all the panelists who are on today sharing their reflections and discussing these very important matters. I wanted to share my sincere condolences to Dr. Williams, as Gigi will be missed. First and foremost, I would be remiss if I did not describe the general sentiments of my colleagues in training since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the disproportional impact it's had on the Black community, and our sentiments in the midst of the videotaped brutalization of Black bodies throughout our country. That sentiment, like Dr. Horn, is generally one of hope. Hope, however, mixed with weariness and fear that the galvanized energy to dismantle systemic racism and institutional oppression, like countless previous instances, will ultimately fade. Nonetheless, we remain encouraged. Throughout my training thus far, I've learned how to keep a little bit of hope while chronically enduring the burden and suffering of being an underrepresented minority in medicine. My experience is certainly shared and definitely not unique to me, but while I train, I had to learn how to effectively code switch and dilute my Blackness in order to not to fit the stereotype, and in order to assimilate into a culture where I'm almost always the only Black person in the room, making sure my T's were a little bit crisper and making sure my white coat was a little bit wider, only to be pulled over by the police on my way back from my midnight studies on numerous terrifying occasions because I quote unquote fit the description. The pain and imagery of being escorted into the hospital by police as I made my way into morning rounds will never leave me, and will certainly stay with the people who witnessed it. We can't breathe. I had to learn how to thrive in a system where when I look around, I fail to see the others who look like me commonly rising amongst the medical hierarchy. This, in the right milieu, sends a very insidious message that I'm an anomaly and I may not be good enough, ever so feeding the baggage of self-doubt that comes with being a Black man in medicine. I need to breathe. I had to learn how to effectively compartmentalize the pain of knowing that you're a part of a culture that also neglects patients who look like you, right? Enrolling patients that look like you into cardiology trials. These are the very same studies that you have to work on in order to advance your career as a nascent physician scientist. How heartbreakingly conflicting is this? Like many other Black physicians, I had to proudly own and bear the burdensome cross of changing my community, building relationships with the police, and pulling others who look like me to where I am today. This is something our colleagues don't have to do, but we must be resilient in our efforts to collectively make changes because we cannot breathe. Always having the color of our skin define our accomplishments, our disappointments, our failures, our profession, and even our service is difficult. Academia cannot avoid our efforts on culture and the legacy and contributions to cardiology, but they can surely avoid the granular and personal specifics. These specifics are hard for me to intellectually sum up into words, and it takes only a Black person in medicine to understand the subtleties of what we all go through. We straight up need more mentors in medicine that look like us. Diversity up front is also about who is behind the scenes and who are the ones pulling the strings. This is why representation in medicine, representation in cardiology matters. Dr. Albert, thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts. I'm proud of the ABC's efforts, and I pray that we all continue to apply pressure on the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for your comments from the level of from a perspective of a fellow as well. So we really appreciate you being here. Our next speaker is Dr. Khadija Breathitt, who's an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Tucson. She's an advanced heart failure and transplant faculty member at that university. Thank you, Dr. Breathitt. And thank you for your patience. You were supposed to be earlier in the program.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me here today. And I also offer my condolences to Dr. Williams. When I think about Black in the Ivory, it brings up suppressed memories of microaggressions, bias, and racism. In my career, I've been told that I cannot sit in a chair and must instead sit on the floor, since the chairs are for those with seniority who are coming later. I've been shoved by a staff member. I've been told that if someone gets hurt because I don't clean up the sharps of a senior team member, that this individual will come and hurt me. I've been challenged on my treatment recommendations and not given respect until after my academic pedigree and success is revealed. I've been instructed to make sure that my research does not offend anyone, since it may play a role in the reviewer's scoring of my grant applications or manuscripts. This does not include the regular microaggressions outside of academic life, such as being followed in a store, challenged on a return, or spoken to with rudeness and general disrespect. I've been dismayed and discouraged, but not diverted from my mission. I chose to become an advanced heart failure transplant cardiologist and physician scientist for one major reason. I wanted to change healthcare in America. I wanted to achieve cardiovascular health equity. I knew the statistics and saw them in my family and friends. Cardiovascular disease was and is continuing to disproportionately affect racial ethnic minorities and women. I've done extensive research funded by NIH to address the what, why, and how, and hope to attain funding addressing how to now fix it. We know that healthcare professionals treat people differently, simply on account of their race and sex. It's a complex form of cognitive dissonance, where many will state that they see no color, but their actions yield a different response. I would encourage you to consider how you play a part in the problem. Learn the past and present history of racism in America. Diversify your workplaces and circle of friends. Learn to appreciate views and values from people who look differently from you and think differently from you. Avoid stereotypes. Individualize relationships. Form shared decision-making relationships with your patients. Standardize treatment plans, which can later be tailored to address individual barriers to care. Consider how you can encourage rather than discourage someone. Personally, my faith, family, friends, supportive mentors, and colleagues have helped me tremendously in my journey. Consider how your role can be used to speak life into someone else's journey. It is my hope that this difficult time is not one that we just rush to get through, but one that we use to rebuild and restructure our lives. We live in one of the most educated and wealthy countries in the world. Let's use these resources to fight racism, achieve equity in health and in opportunity. Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khadija Breathitt, for those wonderful, insightful comments. I want to thank our audience for staying with us at this time. We are over We have 3 more speakers, and we would love for you to stick with us as we continue this powerful tapestry. Our next speaker is Dr. Rachel Bond, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine at Creighton University School of Medicine. She's the system director of women's cardiovascular health at Dignity Health in Arizona.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I am honored to be here today. I'd like to thank the leadership of ABC for planning this webinar and, of course, for the invitation. I'd also like to extend my sincerest condolences to Dr. Williams and his family. The fact is, as a society, we are hurting. There are peaceful protesters out there right now for this cause, protesters that come from every race, every background, and every walk of life. So I am proud to be doing something meaningful by participating in this webinar today, because highlighting and uplifting the voice and image of people of color, professionals of color, and more so, physicians of color are part of the solution. There has been a level of mistrust in the medical field, particularly in the Black community, for hundreds of years. For example, even in our recent history in the 1930s, there was the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where Black men were not provided medical treatment despite a known cure for syphilis as a way to better understand the effects of the disease. This same level of mistrust remains today, but we know having physicians who look and are culturally similar to our patients can help mitigate this. Unfortunately, as we've heard time and time again, this is hard, especially for Black females who comprise only 2% of the medical field. I myself noticed this as I advanced in my career, and I was continuously referred to as a quote-unquote unicorn. And because of this, back in 2018, I actually wrote a letter to my younger self addressing this as a Black female cardiologist. This was published in MedPage Today, and I'd like to share a few excerpts from it. To young Rachel, I am so happy that you decided to be a cardiologist. You're going to go through many hardships on the way, but trust me when I tell you it will all be worth it in the end. Now, Rachel, if you think that being a female cardiologist places you in the minority, wait until you go through your career and realize that being a Black cardiologist is even rarer. This will become very apparent to you as you will be the only African American in your fellowship class and one of a very few to practice at your workplace. Although the trend for diversity in cardiology has been slow, you will be one factor to the solution. You will go on to mentor a whole generation of underrepresented students and trainees. Over time, you will realize that such efforts will prove to help a larger population-based problem where a composite of Americans, mainly Black Americans, are disproportionately plagued by cardiovascular disease and have the highest rates of mortality from it. With the above being said, it seems like a daunting task, but like I said in the beginning, Rachel, you are part of the solution. And I hope you realize that now more than ever. Things won't be easy. You may be mistaken for basically anything but a medical doctor, even after you introduce yourself as such and wear your credentials along with your long white coat. But at the end of it, you could not imagine being anything but a cardiologist. As I said, I wrote this letter in 2018. And since, my experiences have not changed much. In fact, even when I walk into patients' room to this day, identify myself and eloquently address the plan of care, I am asked, when will the doctor be in? Sometimes even other medical professionals ask me the same, but I have changed, my skin is thicker, and I am more easily able to brush these situations off my shoulder, whereas earlier on this would pain me. I had to change my approach because I quickly realized the only way to see meaningful transformation is to not internalize my disappointment, but to be piercingly confident, correct these blunders immediately, use them as an opportunity to educate the closed-minded society we live in, and let my poise in these situations while providing exceptional care for my patients be what shows off those credentials I work so hard for. So people not only see, but they understand what the true face of medicine and cardiology looks like and so desperately needs to be. In closing, my hope for today is that even if just one young person in the audience is able to see me and hear my words, that they can understand that although we may have more obstacles because of the color of our skin or because of our background, it's worth it because our population needs us now more than ever. And there will come a time when this won't be the case. That time may be now, as there are strength in numbers and you have my full support and definitely the support of ABC and others along your path of greatness. If I was able to express that, then I have fulfilled one of my many professional goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. That was very powerful. Our next speaker is Chief Chris Palmer, who's the Chief of Police in Crystal Springs, Mississippi. Those of you who have joined us before may also realize that Mr. Palmer is also a COVID survivor and has contributed to our COVID webinar. Mr. Palmer, good to see you.
Thank you, Dr. Albert. And then my condolences goes out to Dr. Williams also and his family. Being a Black police chief in the South is very, very difficult.
It appears as though we're having some technical difficulties.
Can you hear me, Dr. Albert?
I can hear you now, Mr. Palmer. Continue on.
Like I was saying, being a Black police chief in the South is very difficult. When I first took the job, I went into a courtroom and I noticed that we were 70% white, but our court was 95% Black. And I noticed there were a lot of disparities in our judicial system at that time. What I went in and did, I implemented a lot of community policing, because my thought is you can't police a culture you don't know. You can't police a person if you don't know their culture. And that's what I've stressed to my officers, is that you go out, you learn your people. You can police them better when you know your people. You can understand them better, they understand you better. From that, we've also found that having that seat that Chief Scott was talking about at the table, and you're the only Black at the table, is hard also. So I have to be well-rounded in what I do and making my statements in the public, at the table, and defending my people when we're at the table. I know we're short for time and I'm not gonna hold you long, but I just wanna tell you one story. I had one kid come up to me and say, "Sir, how can I not be a sex offender?" And he told me the story of how he became a sex offender. He became a sex offender because his mother didn't have $50 to pay the public defender to defend him. So he pled guilty to a charge that he wasn't guilty of. So those are the disparities that we run into here in the South. And we're trying to mentor these kids, get them more educated, and get them on a path to where they could be more productive citizens and learn and you can to progress more with their. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Chief Chris Palmer. Our next speaker, and our last speaker, besides the close, is Dr. Tavis Batts, who's chairman of medical specialties and medical director of cardiology clinic at Wilford Hall Ambulatory Surgical Center. He's an associate professor of cardiovascular medicine for the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. Welcome, Dr. Batts.
Thank you, Dr. Albert. Again, after the speakers that we heard and the development of the ABC and coordinating this has been a powerful webinar. Again, my condolences to Dr. Williams. I'll have just a few quick points. And again, if I think about everything that we talked about and putting it all together, I would title this, again, Potential in a Pandemic. Healthcare disparities and police brutality are not something new. And again, if we think about that, again, we could stop right there at just pain. Unfortunately, we can't do that. I'll lead in with a quick story. You know, I was out yesterday with my daughter and we were enjoying some vegan food, and a police car drove up. And my daughter made the comment, "Dad, be careful. I'm gonna keep my eye on him, just drive safely." And as a parent, as a father, I felt powerless, right? After that pain, oftentimes we feel powerless, and you wonder, what can we do despite the degrees, despite everything we've done, despite whatever accolades that we've had in this environment, what can you do? The next story is one where when this all started, I reached out to a mentor who is not African American. And after I had discussed actually just a consult with him, I thanked him for his rather public response on Facebook. At that moment, there was an awkward silence, and I could hear him weeping. I could hear him weeping because he didn't know how to explain how someone could be killed so blatantly on the news, and we see it over and over, and we almost become desensitized. He was lost for words, and all he could say to me was, "I'm sorry." So as we move forward and we think about these points for potential, we've heard them throughout this conversation, whether it be through strategies to develop a pipeline so that, again, people see African Americans in various different ways, or other people of color in various different ways through the pipeline. Or could it be through policy changes? Again, Dr. Ferdinand highlighted articulately all the things that lead up to, again, African-American males have the lowest life expectancy across the board. But again, what health policy changes can we make to ensure that those things are improved? And then finally, and this is one that, again, you don't have to be a doctor to do this. You don't have to be, have degrees and various things to do this. But we can work through prevention. As we mentioned, healthcare disparities are there, but that doesn't change the fact that, again, food deserts and dietary choices oftentimes impact what we do. Attitudes and behaviors toward where we push our kids, as opposed to me spending 5 hours at a baseball camp, why not a STEM program? What I'm saying is there is potential in this pandemic, and it starts with us. Again, thank you, Association of Black Cardiologists, and I appreciate all of you for staying tuned.
Thank you, Dr. Batts. And I want to say to the audience that we're coming to our close. And I want to thank from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of the ABC Board of Directors, you who poured your hearts out today to give us 21 unique stories and recommendations about a path moving forward. So on behalf of the Association of Black Cardiologists, I want to thank you for joining us today. We hope that these stories motivate you to act decisively for the marathon, not for the sprint, especially the stories about being a mentor, helping us get a seat at the table, getting a seat at the table, stories about implicit bias, both for patients, families, and for providers. Stories about demanding quality and equitable healthcare. Important. We hope that you choose to become a member of the Association of Black Cardiologists, which is now needed more than ever. We hope that you choose to support us in small as well as in very, very big ways. We all need to work together to stamp out health and other disparities. Once more, I want to thank our speakers. Thanks to the ABC staff, especially our CEO, Ms. McCullough, Alan Merritt, and Rachel Williams. Please visit the ABC website for more information about the Association of Black Cardiologists COVID-19 Innovation Awards. We hope to see many applications from you, our audience. We dedicate this webinar to all persons who have lost their lives due to race, ethnicity, and to Ms. Janita Evangelista Gigi Johnson. Please visit our website for the posting of this webinar, which will be done within the next 12 hours. Thank you very much for joining us.